People say that immigrants have been being treated unfairly and thrown out of the country in recent years, but it is not the first time in history that immigrants are being treated unfairly. For example, there's the Sacco and Vanzetti case. 97 years ago, on April 15, 1920, a paymaster for a shoe company in South Braintree, Massachusetts, was killed and shot along with his guard during a murder and robbery. On July 14, 1921, Nicola Sacco and Bartolomeo Vanzetti were found guilty of this crime. They were sentenced to death and were electrocuted in the electric chair on August 23, 1927. They died in Charlestown State Prison, Massachusetts. This was a very controversial crime which affected the social climate all around the world. There was never a compromise to this conflict because these men were never given a fair trial to prove themselves innocent. The Sacco and Vanzetti case was a very controversial time in history. This case caused many changes in the social climate in the United States. The Sacco and Vanzetti case caused many problems before and after their death, such as protests and bombing in different cities. The protests caused another part of conflict during these times. The protesters were two sides with different opinions of the men's case. One side was the people who believed that Sacco and Vanzetti were innocent, while the other side believed they were guilty. The side that believed they were innocent believed this because they thought the evidence against the two men was flimsy, or that there was not enough evidence to accuse Sacco and Vanzetti. The people who said they were guilty were mostly just racially profiling them because the suspects are described as two Italian men. They were also accusing them because they were immigrants. Many Americans did not want immigrants in America because they could easily take their jobs. Many protests by the two sides were held regarding the Sacco and Vanzetti case. For example, in 1921, there was a protest to save Sacco and Vanzetti and to also convince the world they were innocent. The protest took place on a Sunday in London at Trafalgar Square. There was also a protest in Union Square in New York City. This protest took place on April 19, 1927. The disagreements between the two sides during these protests caused a lot of controversy and change in the social climate in history.
The two sides of this conflict were the group that believed the men were innocent and the group that believed they were guilty. The crime that was believed Sacco and Vanzetti committed caused the social climate to be tense and be a big problem all around the world. The case caused many protests and a couple bombings. For example, in 1921 there was a protest to save Sacco and Vanzetti and also convince the world that they were innocent. The protest took place on a Sunday in London at Trafalgar Square. There was also a protest at Union Square in New York City. These protests show how big this problem was and the causes that came from it. The case of Sacco and Vanzetti was a big conflict in history. The two men were both Italian immigrants. The suspects were described as two Italian men that had robbed with over $15,000. Sacco and Vanzetti were charged and arrested for the crime. On July 14, 1921, they were convicted and sentenced to die. The men never got a fair trial. This was a big part of the conflict because there was also no evidence of the stolen money, but they were still guilty to the court because there were two Italian immigrants that were being racially profiled. Many of the protesters were also Italian immigrants or even immigrants from other places. These immigrants thought that Sacco and Vanzetti were sentenced to death because they were undocumented immigrants and were being discriminated from America. The conflict of this whole topic was mostly of Sacco and Vanzetti not getting a fair trial due to Americans racially profiling these immigrants. This explains how racial profiling affected the men's trial.
Sadly, there was no compromise because Sacco and Vanzetti ended up being electrocuted. They didn't get a fair trial, which didn't give them a chance to prove their innocence. Something else that was not fair was that in November 1925, Celestino confessed to committing the Braintree crimes. He absolved Sacco and Vanzetti of participation. Celestino was a young Portuguese who was present during the murder. Celestino was also sentenced to death, but this did not change what would happen to Sacco and Vanzetti. On August 23, 1927, Nicola Sacco marched to the death chair at 12:11 and was pronounced lifeless at 12:19. Bartolomeo Vanzetti marched to the chair at 12:11 and declared dead at 12:26. This shows that since the men died, there was no compromise to this conflict. Since there was no compromise to the conflict, it made a bigger impact to the United States history. Since the conflict ended badly, the world was very upset when Sacco and Vanzetti died, especially the immigrants. This made a bigger conflict because Americans thought discriminating immigrants was fine, but the other immigrants were upset about the way they were being treated. This increased racial profiling and discrimination towards immigrants, especially Italians. Today, discrimination still exists, but back when Sacco and Vanzetti were convicted of the murder, Americans did not treat immigrants fairly. This still happens today. For example, President Donald Trump discriminates all immigrants, especially Mexicans and other Hispanics. Trump believes that Mexicans are the people who are affecting the U.S. in a negative way. He states, "They are sending people that have lots of problems and they are bringing those problems with us. They are bringing drugs, they are bringing crime, they are rapists, and some I assume are good people." Trump said this about Mexican immigrants and what he believes their impact is on the U.S. This is just one example of how racial profiling and discrimination against immigrants still affects the U.S.
The Sacco Vanzetti case was a very controversial time in history. With two sides with different opinions of the problem, the conflict was affecting the social climate all around the world. The legacy left behind was an increase in racial profiling towards immigrants. There was no compromise to this conflict because the men were injustly being sentenced to death without a fair trial. The ones who affected the long-term legacy were the two sides of this conflict, which were the ones who believed Sacco and Vanzetti were innocent and the ones who believed they were guilty. This explains the legacy left behind from this conflict. The lesson that people should learn from this time in history is that immigrants should not be discriminated. Not all immigrants should be accused of any crime just because they came to the U.S. illegally. Everyone should be treated equally. This explains what the lesson learned is from the Sacco Vanzetti case.